Asia's monarchies defy history. In a modern era of democracy, worlds of tradition, mystery, and ritual command fascination and respect like never before. Asian monarchs are symbols of continuity, living connections to the past that are often loved and loathed in equal measure. In Nepal, the monarchy was ousted from power after 250 years of rule and replaced by an uneasy republic. Deposed and humiliated, the former king can still inspire devotion among many of the people. The story of the Shahs is one of murder, intrigue, genius and madness, overshadowed by an ancient family curse. And the final act in this blood-soaked drama was the assassination of the king and queen by their son, the heir to the throne. The history of the Shahs is the history of Nepal, and one that still divides the nation to this day. To visitors, Nepal is a ravishingly beautiful mountain land of temples and religious devotion where Hinduism and Buddhism have coexisted peacefully for hundreds of years. This is the most ethnically diverse country in Asia, where dozens of cultures have lived in harmony for centuries. But this harmony has never been reflected in the history of its royal family. Nepal's royal drama centers around the capital of Nepal, Kathmandu, the cradle of power and the focus of the country's politics. Despite the recent overthrow of the monarchy, the question of its possible return is one that dominates public debate. Monarchists and anti-monarchists vie with each other under an unstable government.
We have to slaughter king. I have already told you, we have to slaughter king.
But on the streets of Kathmandu, the people still turn out in thousands to celebrate the birthday of the last king of Nepal, Gyanendra.
From my heart, I support my king, and he lives long life.
The story of Nepal and the Shahs is one of a struggle for unity and harmony. From the founder, Prithvi Narayan Shah, right through to today, the Shah rule has been characterized by ever-repeating cycles of violence. Prithvi Narayan Shah was a great warrior chieftain who unified Nepal and founded the royal dynasty of the Shahs. Rajendra Shah was mentally ill, and his reign saw the descent of the Shahs into factionalism and the first mass murder in Nepal's royal drama. Tribhuvan Shah brought the monarchy back to prominence after almost a century of obscurity as mere puppet kings. Mahendra Shah dabbled in politics and tried to regain absolute power, returning his family to factionalism and infighting. Birendra Shah tried to modernize the monarchy and usher in democracy, and paid with his life. As fractured as its history may be, there's always been one unifying force in Nepal: its religion, Hinduism. Kathmandu, the sprawling capital, sits in the mountain basin high in the foothills of the Himalayas. Its many temples and statues to the gods are as relevant today as they've always been. On Hindu festival days, the whole city stops to pray and to purify, and to party on the streets.
This festival in Nepal is known as the Janai Purnima. This particular locale is associated with Hindu god Shiva. It's a temple called Kumbheshwar. Not only is it sacred to Hindus, but local shamans who belong to the Tamang community. For them also this is a very important festival. So you see a lot of shamans, beating the drums and dancing around. They first take a bath in the pond here, cleanse themselves, and go to a temple, which is a Shiva temple nearby, to basically pay homage to Lord Shiva. So what this does is it blends local varieties of religion together with Hinduism.
The focus of public devotion on these festivals used to be twofold. First was always the Kumari, a young girl revered as a living goddess. The second was the royal family themselves as keepers of the Hindu flame. And the Shahs were always careful to merge the religious and royal devotions of their people, enforcing the image of themselves as semi-divine beings. But what is particularly interesting is their choice of a personal family deity, Kali, a vengeful goddess who demands blood sacrifices from her followers. And the Shahs were to pay the ultimate sacrifice.
I remember getting calls from my relatives that, have you heard, have you heard, have you heard? We're hearing, the gunfires in the palace.
In one terrible night in 2001, Nepal made world headlines with the murder of almost the entire royal family by their heir to the throne, Crown Prince Dipendra. At a Friday night family party, a heavily armed Dipendra shot his father, King Birendra, his mother, brother, sister, and 5 other members of his close family, before finally turning his gun on himself.
It was a shock. It was a shock, because one could not expect that such a horrendous act can be enacted.
Worshipped as semi-gods throughout their history, the all-too-human nature of the Shahs had been revealed.
He is not a god. I tell you, he is not a god. If he was a god, this would not happen.
If the Shahs weren't gods themselves, then perhaps they were subject to the will of a real god. To many in Nepal, a land where myth and legend are part of the fabric of everyday life, the royal massacre is simply the fulfillment of an ancient curse laid upon the founder of the Shah dynasty, Prithvi Narayan Shah. Legend has it that Shah was walking through the forest one day when he encountered an old wise man. In fact, the venerated saint Gorakhnath in disguise. Dutifully, Shah offered the man a bowl of curd to show his respect. The old man drank it all and then regurgitated it back into the bowl. He asked Shah to drink it to show his devotion. Repulsed, Shah dashed the bowl to the ground, where the foul liquid covered his feet. Gorakhnath then cursed him, saying that his dynasty will only last the number of generations that he had toes, 10. The 11th king would be the last. Throughout its history, the curse has overshadowed the House of Shah. But would it really come true? Nepal's monarchy may be no more, but they are still national heroes to its people. Here in Kathmandu, statues in their honor dominate the streets and buildings. But the story of the Shahs begins more than 100 miles away from Kathmandu, here in Gorkha. This was the birthplace of Prithvi Narayan Shah, the young man who would be king. It was a humble beginning for the man who was to create Nepal and found its ruling dynasty.
During Prithvi Narayan's younger years, he would have lived in comparatively humble circumstances, with not a lot of money or resources to play with, and an area that was not rich in agriculture.
Gorkha alone could never satisfy the ambitions of this young man. He wanted to rule over a far greater kingdom.
So what he is said to have done is to have walked one day to the rim of the Kathmandu Valley, looked down over it and said, you know, one day all this will be mine.
Kathmandu was the key to Nepal. It was not only one of the most fertile areas in the region, it lay at the heart of an important trade route between India and Tibet, giving it access to great wealth. The prize was enormous, but for a young chieftain and a small army, so were the risks.
The main strategy President Shah developed to conquer the Kathmandu Valley was to conquer the surrounding areas of Kathmandu Valley. And after that, he needed a place from where a direct attack would be made on Kathmandu within 2 or 3 hours. And that place he selected was Kirtipur.
For 12 years, Prithvi Narayan Shah and his army lay siege to Kirtipur. It took 4 attempts before it finally fell. But it came at a high price for the young prince. He lost his best general, Kalu Pandey, and his own brother. The exploits of Shah's army are still a vivid part of local folklore in Kirtipur. It's not hard to find locals who will tell the tale of the grisly end of Kalu Pandey.
यो गेट जुन छ त्यसको सिधा एउटा बाउन्ड्री वाल अहिले पनि केही बाँकी छ तर यो नयाँ भइसक्यो त्यहाँबाट अट्याक हुँदाखेरि उले हाम्रो कीर्तिपुरको सेनाले उलाई लखेटे यहीबाट यो पुरानो बाटो हो यहाँबाट लखेटे त्यही पर पुगेपछि त्यो लड्यो त्यहाँ त्यसले त्यही पुगेपछि काट्यो.
Both armies paid a high price. Finally, Shah tried to seek a solution and approached the ruler of Kirtipur to peacefully enter the city.
Did have a kind of an agreement with the leaders of Kirtipur that they would smooth the way in for him, and they must have changed their minds.
At the last moment, Kirtipur closed its doors to Shah, and the bloody siege continued. When Kirtipur finally fell, Shah exacted revenge on its people. He cut off the lips and noses of every single man in the city.
Why the cut noses? Well, you know, the traditional punishment of the Gurkhali in those days for a faithless wife was to cut off the nose. This was the punishment for adultery. And perhaps for Prithvi Narayan that was symbolic of the fact that they had broken an agreement.
This brutal act also had the effect of giving Shah a fearsome reputation. In Kathmandu, its ruler Jayaprakash Malla simply fled when he heard Shah and his army were marching towards his city. Shah entered Kathmandu and made it his capital in 1769, so laying the foundations for the Kingdom of Nepal.
Prithvi Narayan Shah is built into this great national figure of the creator of the nation, or as they say in Nepal, the unifier of the nation, because the nationalist vision has it that Nepal already existed. It was just lying around in bits, and all it needed was the visionary to come along and assemble it.
In 1775, just a few years after the capture of his prize, the warrior king, the man who created the unified Nepal, died. Immediately, his court fell into disarray. Shah had created a kingdom and established the House of Shah as rulers, but he hadn't set out the laws of succession.
in Asia, in Nepal, kings had more than one legal wife. And when you look at it like that, and you look at the animosities that are likely to arrive, you can see that there must have been great tussles for succession between the sons of different legal wives and even the sons of concubines. This creates all these tensions and struggles.
But the infighting didn't stop there.
The bickering and the fighting was more among the surrounding families, but it wasn't helped by the fact that the monarchy itself, after Prithvi Narayan Shah, was occupied by people of much lower caliber. Either they were minors, they were young, too young to rule, so regents ruled in their stead, or they had mental health problems in a couple of cases.
It was in this febrile atmosphere that Rajendra came to the throne. And during his reign, this factionalism was to come to a head and draw to a murderous conclusion. Rajendra came to the throne in 1816, at the age of just 3. He was completely controlled by his all-powerful Prime Minister, Bhimsen Thapa, the latest in the line of Thapas who had ruled over the weak child kings that followed Prithvi Narayan Shah. Rajendra was kept in isolation, unable even to leave the palace. In 1837, however, he finally flexed his muscles, forced Thapa from power, and took over direct rule. Unfortunately, he was a less than ideal candidate to be king.
Rajendra, just looking at it from the eyes of the 21st century, I would say that he had a bipolar disorder. Sometimes he was probably very, very reasonable, and sometimes he was very despondent, and sometimes he was high. His excesses were mainly in his cruelty. He took people's caste away by smearing them with feces, with human feces. He would bring out laws and edicts, and he would change them the next day.
And this lack of judgment and control was felt in his relationships with his 2 queens and their sons. In particular, Rajendra's strange behavior affected his eldest son, Crown Prince Surendra. Surendra should have been the automatic heir to the throne, but Rajendra favored his youngest queen, Lakshmi Devi. In 1843, Rajendra issued a decree stating that his subjects should only obey his younger queen Lakshmi Devi over the crown prince. Surendra was feeling increasingly insecure.
I think his son was more dangerous than him, Crown Prince Surendra. And I think that's partially probably because of his father's condition, but partially because of very insecure upbringing that he had. His younger mother and her coterie were trying to get rid of him in favor of his younger brother, her eldest son. That can make you very, very insecure if you feel people are trying to murder you.
The battle between the young queen Lakshmi Devi and Crown Prince Surendra was to lead to the first of Nepal's royal massacres.
The junior queen of King Rajendra wanted to place her own son on the throne of Nepal as against the claim of the eldest son of the king. So, in this connection, the queen took the help of one powerful courtier whose name was Gagan Singh. But unfortunately, Gagan Singh was suddenly killed. And when Gagan Singh was killed, then the queen felt herself a kind of orphan, you know. Now she had no friend to assist her to place her son on the throne.
The queen was isolated. She sought the help of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, Jang Bahadur. As military commander, he controlled a large army. She asked him to force all the leading courtiers together so she could find the murderer of her favorite courtier, Gagan Singh.
Instead of detecting the murderer, there were clashes among the courtiers, and almost all the high-level courtiers were killed, and only Janga Bahadur and his brothers survived, and hence began the Rana rule in the history of Nepal.
In the mayhem that followed the Kot massacre, Jang Bahadur saw his chance to seize control. He instigated a military coup and deposed the king. He sent Rajendra and Lakshmi Devi into exile and installed Surendra on the throne. Like the Thapa family before him, Bahadur kept the young king under permanent house arrest and under his control. He made himself permanent prime minister. Learning from the mistakes of the Shahs, he established a line of succession for his own family to inherit his office, taking the hereditary title of Rana. And so began a century of Rana rule, with a succession of puppet kings. So how would the House of Shah rise again to rule Nepal? Nepal's royal family is no stranger to bloodshed and intrigue. The Kot massacre in 1846 and the subsequent power struggle in the court was to rock the Shah royal family and banish it from power for over 100 years. After decades of court politics and unstable rulers, the Ranas, a ruthless dynasty of hereditary prime ministers, emerged from the shadows of Nepal's elite. The Shahs remained under virtual house arrest, figureheads cloistered in their palaces. A symbolic monarchy led spurious authority to the Rana usurpers, but were in practical terms powerless.
Well, people say that the Shah monarchy reigned, but it didn't rule. It was the Ranas that ran the country, with the kings functioning as a figurehead for their government.
The Ranas maintained their grip on power by ensuring they didn't fall into the same trap as the Shahs. They set in place definite rules on succession.
The Ranas adopted the line of succession not under the principles of primogeniture. If the Rana prime minister dies, he was succeeded by the eldest member in the family. And in that system, there was no question of the minor prime ministers. The prime ministers who succeeded the Ranas, they were all matured. They were all more than 40 or 50 years of age. That's why there was no minor prime minister.
The Ranas had learned from the monarchy's mistakes, but they also learned from the vision of Nepal's founder.
I think in the isolation, the Ranas were carrying out Prithvinarayan Shah's vision of the pure state. That is, you close your borders, you make sure that nothing bad can come in, your enemies can't infiltrate.
They maintained the notion of Nepal as an independent state with its own unique identity. And it was this desire to preserve the sanctity of their borders that led them to seek out an ally in the region. If there was one thing that the Ranas recognized, it was the strength and importance of the British Empire across the world, and particularly on their own doorstep. Their huge neighbor to the south, India, was under Britain's rule, and the Ranas had courted the British assiduously throughout their regime. Britain, in turn, saw the importance of a stable and friendly state on their northern border, and gave the Rana regime their full support. It was an alliance that defined the century of Rana rule in Nepal, and the loss of which was to signal the end of their power. In 1947, a political earthquake shook the Rana regime to its foundations.
Lord Mountbatten bids farewell to the first British troops. An Indian Guard of Honor is drawn up in salute to the men whose departure symbolizes the end of British rule.
Almost overnight, the British vanished from India, and with them, the Rana's support.
The Rana prime ministers lost the guardianship of the British government. That is the most important thing. Then the new Indian government was not in favor of continuing the dictatorial rule of the Ranas. Rather, they wanted some sort of democratic government in Nepal.
The Ranas were too closely associated with the British for the liking of the newly independent India and its charismatic Prime Minister, Nehru. They wanted their close neighbor to be ruled by someone untainted by an alliance with the British.
Nehru wanted a democratic government in Nepal, right? But he did not want a full democratic government in Nepal. The Rana regime should be ended, but the new regime should be under the leadership of the king, not under the leadership of the people's representative. That's why Pandit Nehru played a very active role in the movement of 1950, and all the negotiations in Delhi took place under his guidance.
The Rana regime was coming under pressure from outside its borders. At the same time, pressure was building inside the country for change.
The Indian nationalist movement, the Indian Congress movement that had secured independence for India, greatly influenced a small number of middle-class Nepalese of higher caste who were receiving their education in Indian cities during the 30s and 40s, and to some extent in emulation of the Indian nationalist movement, formed their own political parties, which were small, but were then poised to sort of take on some of the momentum of the Indian political struggle and apply it to their own context.
Nepal needed a new ruler and a new government. All eyes turned to the Shahs. Tribhuvan had been on the throne since 1911, but like his forefathers before him, every part of his life had been controlled by successive Ranas. First, Judha Shansha Rana, and then in 1945, Mohan Shansha Rana. He was too weak to take back power for himself, but the leaders of the new democratic movements could.
Once the British had gone, the Ranas were wide open to that kind of opposition, and armed insurrection, in fact, took place for a period of time in 1949, 1950. And they were also able to engage with the king and show him that they would reinstate him as a ruler if he aided them in their struggle and gave them certain guarantees about the introduction of democracy and so on after he had been reinstated.
As the opposition mounted, the Prime Minister Mohan Shansha Rana tightened his control. If Tribhuvan was to get out from under the Rana rule, he would have to get out of Nepal.
The king's movements were quite closely controlled, and in 1950, on the pretext of going off to a hunting expedition with his entourage and most of his family, King Tribhuvan left his palace, but instead of taking the route that he was expected to take, suddenly turned sharply off the road into the Indian embassy, where he asked for some kind of political asylum, was flown out of the country to New Delhi.
The entire royal family was in exile, except for the king's 3-year-old grandson, Gyanendra. In a last-ditch attempt to save the Rana regime, the Prime Minister had him crowned king, hoping to rule over another puppet monarch. But to no avail. The people of Nepal looked to the absent king as their savior. Tribhuvan's flight to India, that could have been seen as a mere desire to save his own life, was cleverly managed to look like a move to save his people. And in 1951, King Tribhuvan returned to Kathmandu a national hero.
Tribhuvan is important for his symbolism. There was a king who was willing to sacrifice his throne for the sake of people, for the sake of democracy. So the symbol of King Tribhuvan leaving his palace and taking refuge in embassy and eventually Delhi symbolizes a king willing to leave his throne for the sake of the people. So what that symbolism does, it unites the people's leaders and the monarch together. Both of them were involved in the overthrow of the Ranas. So that gesture by Tribhuvan was fundamental in restoring monarchy in Nepal.
Having regained his throne, Tribhuvan honored his agreement with the leaders of the democratic movement and opened the doors to change.
He was recognized as the father of democracy in Nepal by all and sundry, even today. They have not attacked, the Republican forces have not attacked that symbolism that he carries.
After centuries of absolute rule, first by the Shahs and then the Ranas, the transition to a fledgling democracy was bound to be difficult.
The democracy that was ushered in 1950 was a very unstable one. There was intense political instability, and this went on and on and on till 1955 when he died, and his son took over, which is King Mahendra.
Mahendra came to the throne in 1955. At the time, Nepal's young democratic system was in turmoil, and there was deep unrest amongst the people. He saw this as an opportunity to impose his authority on the nation and lead his country forward to a new age.
He was a very ambitious person. He grew up in a very traditional milieu. He did not receive formal Western education. He received all of his education within the palace premises. But he was a very traditional Hindu monarch. He saw his role as a protector of the kingdom, as a benefactor.
Mahendra moved to take back some of the king's traditional powers, whilst at the same time opening the door to more modern influences.
Basically, when he took upon the responsibility of the government, he tried to become a very benevolent kind of a ruler, a benevolent dictator, if you will. It is to his credit that the modernization process began in Nepal. He enacted certain laws that led to land reform. He put a ceiling on big land holdings. He also enacted certain legislatures that prohibited the caste system. So he tried to do away with what he considered some of the more backward practices, and in so doing, he tried to modernize the country.
Mahendra was walking a political tightrope and trying to be both a far-sighted modernizer and a benevolent dictator. And it was this contradiction that he brought to the throne of Nepal that was to lead to the final fall of the House of Shah in a single night of unimaginable horror. Nepal's many diverse cultures, languages, and ethnic groups present a rich tapestry to the outside world, but a huge problem for its political rulers. Mahendra struggled with the dual role of benevolent dictator and modernizer. He saw his responsibility as King of Nepal to provide strong leadership and stability for his country.
He was a nationalist to the core, and he believed that the political parties were not in a position to lead the country towards stability or towards modernization or towards progress. And although he believed this, he allowed the parties to continue for another 5 years, where in 1960 he declared that it was not possible to run the country with parties anymore and declared a partyless system.
Mahendra introduced the Panchayat system of governance, in which he was the sole overseer of a network of local administration centers led by local leaders. Perhaps he truly believed he was the only one who could lead Nepal safely into the modern age. But the democracy movement was not to be silenced. Demonstrators took to the streets of Kathmandu. Riots and strikes grew increasingly common. In 1972, in the midst of this turmoil, Mahendra died, leaving his son Birendra to cope with this crisis. The new King Birendra had truly been handed a poison chalice as he came to the throne. his ascension was overshadowed by crises both ancient and modern. His family had, according to legend, been blighted by a curse which stated that the House of Shah would only rule for 10 generations before being ousted from their throne. Birendra was the 10th generation Shah king. He also inherited a country in turmoil, with demonstrators taking to the streets to demand change, together with an escalating threat from Maoist revolutionaries.
In 1979, when faced by student riots in the streets of Kathmandu, he declared that there would be a national referendum on the country's political system. The country would be asked whether it wanted to continue with what was then called the panchayat system, whether the country wanted to move from that to a more inclusive, multi-party style of democracy. And the country was asked this question. So people said, wow, Birendra, he's given us the choice. There, I think he earned some credit for having been willing at least to open it up for national discussion.
The referendum duly took place, and the people narrowly voted to keep the panchayat system. Despite this, the mood for change continued, until in early 1990, it once more exploded onto the streets, this time with deadly consequences. Seeing his citizens being gunned down forced Birendra's hand, and he finally agreed to step down as absolute ruler and became a constitutional monarch. This dramatic move may have brought peace to the country, but it caused an enormous split within the royal family itself.
Generally, it is said that King Birendra was alone in the royal family for his democratic ideas. And it is generally said that his stepmother, Queen Ratna, the wife of King Mahendra, she was very much eager to continue the system established by her husband, King Mahendra. Similarly, the Queen Aishwarya, the wife of Birendra, she was also quite eager to exercise the power as the queen. His brother, Gyanendra, was also not in a favor to surrender power to the people.
Once again, the Shah king found himself surrounded by competing factions.
It doesn't seem to have been a very healthy family, does it? When one looks at, events of the last 10 years or so. So it's difficult to speculate on relationships within the family, but one senses that this isn't a very cohesive little unit. There was always the sense that within the palace, there was this faction that was always going to try and undermine any kind of democratization movement.
Despite his family's opposition, Birendra gave over power to an elected government. But Nepal's problems did not stop there. His new government was wrecked by infighting and ineffectiveness, opening the door to a new movement for change, the communists.
After 1990, the failure of the elected government to to govern the country in a most satisfactory manner led to the rise of Maoists within the Communist Party. But later on, it adopted violent methods in most of the parts of the country.
In 1996, the Maoists announced the People's War and launched a campaign of attacks. It would cost the lives of 14,000 people. Back at the palace, the royal family was divided about how to respond to the insurgency. Some pushed for a hardline military option. But Birendra, increasingly isolated, preferred a softer approach.
One of the features to note, I think, which is significant, is the fact that the Royal Nepalese Army wasn't deployed against the Maoist insurgency until the Maoist insurgency had taken a very large hold over a very large section of the country. And that is said to have been because Birendra was unwilling to use the army in that way, because he didn't wish his army, his Nepalese army, to be shooting Nepalese citizens. But a sort of darker reading of that is that the monarchy actually wanted the Maoist insurgency to grow and become out of control, because they saw that as a way of getting rid of the political parties and undermining the democracy that they were never very keen of in the first place.
The House of Shah has never been far from rumor and intrigue. Their history is littered with conspiracy theories, tales of backstage deals, and power brokering. But now, the splits within the royal family were literally to tear them apart.
I was in Moscow airport when I heard about the massacre, and when I first heard about it, I said it cannot be believed.
I remember getting calls from my relatives that, have you heard, have you heard, have you heard? We're hearing, the gunfires in the palace. It was a shock. It was a shock.
Because one could not expect that such a horrendous act can be enacted.
And the phone rang, and it was a Nepali friend who said, "Oh my God, it's terrible, I can't believe it." And I said, "What?" And he said, "The whole royal family's been killed."
On the 1st of June 2001, the royal family gathered as they usually did on Fridays for a family evening. The Crown Prince Dipendra left the sitting room where his family sat chatting and went to his apartment. There he armed himself with an M16 rifle and an MP5K machine pistol. He returned to the sitting room and started firing. He killed half of his family in that one room. His mother and brother escaped into the palace grounds. Dipendra pursued them and shot them dead. Finally, he turned his gun on himself.
Sometime even now, I sometimes wake up and say, was that real? Particularly, I felt the then Crown Prince, he was a highly intelligent man. All right. How would an intelligent man commit such a horrendous act? That's sometimes still hits me.
No one really knows for sure why Dipendra killed his family. And as ever with Nepal's royal history, conspiracy theories are rife. Some say Dipendra wanted to depose his father and install himself as king, bringing the monarchy back to absolute rule. Others say he was maneuvered into murder by his uncle, the king's younger brother, who himself wanted to be king. Yet others say he was merely angry that his parents wouldn't let him marry the woman he loved, Ridyani Rana, a member of the infamous Rana dynasty, old enemies of the Shahs.
Never in the history, even in our mythology, in the Hindu mythology, it's common for kings to kill other kings. But the father being killed by the son, the fratricide and the regicide that took place, and the matricide, was unusual and unprecedented in anybody's history, not even any Greek mythology nor Hindu mythology beats this. So it was an absolute shock.
The Shah dynasty has been steeped in mythology from its very beginning, with the tale of the curse laid upon its founder, Prithvi Narayan Shah, and it looked as if the curse had come true. Birendra, the 10th generation of Shah kings, was dead, and it was supposed that the 11th king was to be the arbiter of the final fall of the House of Shah. On the 4th of June 2001, Birendra's brother, Gyanendra, was crowned king. It was to be his second coronation. He'd been crowned at the age of 3 during King Tribhuvan's exile in India, and almost 50 years later, he ascended to the throne again. His second rule was to be as inauspicious as his first.
He always had political ambitions. So when this came up, on one hand, he saw this as an opportunity. But we should also understand, as an individual and as a family member, he had lost everything around him. And that did have a devastating effect, definitely, on him.
Unloved, unwanted, and facing a Maoist revolution, it was the worst of possible circumstances for the aging businessman to start a new career. However, he had plans to make his mark.
King Gyanendra had the conservative ideas. He was of the opinion that the king should exercise his real power. But when he became the king, his activities showed that, yes, he wanted to exercise the power of the king in the fullest sense of the term.
Any hopes that Gyanendra might pursue the liberal and low-key policies of his brother were soon dashed.
He tried to suppress both the Maoist and the political parties at the same time.
In 2005, just like his father Mahendra had in 1960, Gyanendra sacked the parliament and took control as absolute monarch. Press freedom was curtailed and political activists were locked up. Gyanendra thought he was restoring peace and stability, but it looked like a dictatorship. And it was to be the final nail in the coffin of the Shah monarchy.
His attempt to suppress these two political forces and impose his own personal rule in the country, I think finally led to the downfall of monarchy in the country.
The people were outraged at Gyanendra's actions, and once again violence hit the streets in Nepal. Gyanendra realized he had gone too far, and on 24th April 2006, he restored the parliament. But this would not save him, and 3 weeks later, the parliament stripped him of his powers. In 2007, the monarchy was finally scrapped.
Gyanendra per se had the great opportunity perhaps to be the most, sort of successful ruler in Nepali history if he had pursued an agenda of reform. But rather than that, they got so engaged in the political game that, sort of led to, sort of the downfall of the monarchy.
Despite the ousting of the monarchy, there are many in Nepal who still love the Shahs and call for their return. But if the curse on Prithvi Narayan Shah is to be believed, this is the final act of this particular royal drama. Gyanendra was indeed the 11th king of Nepal, the one who would preside over a catastrophic fall from power, as bloody and dramatic as the legendary curse promised. It may be just legend, but throughout its history, there does seem to have been a shadow cast over the House of Shah. Born in war, the Shahs lived out their destiny against an ever-shifting landscape of bloody feuds and political intrigue before dying out in confusion and horror. Perhaps it is simply a case of being cursed to live in a cycle of history repeating itself. The Shah story should end here, but perhaps the cycle has one more revolution to turn. The Shahs have already made one triumphant return from obscurity when Tribhuvan faced down the Rana Prime Minister in 1950. Can the Shahs possibly rise once more to claim their place as kings of Nepal?